I didn't scream when they locked the door behind me. I didn't beg. I stood there, 65 years old, with the weight of silence pressing harder than any hand ever could. They thought they had ended my story that night, but what they didn't know was this: sometimes silence is only the beginning of the loudest fight of your life. The evening it all began seemed ordinary. I was folding laundry in the small sitting room when I noticed something different. The family photos that had always hung above the mantel was gone. In its place, there was a bright, abstract painting, too loud for the walls I had chosen years ago with care. I asked my daughter-in-law Denise about it. She laughed softly, dismissing my words. "We just wanted a fresher look, Mama. Times change." I nodded, but deep inside, I felt the first chill of being erased. I had lived in that house for more than 3 decades. I raised my son Marcus there, watched him grow from a boy who loved toy trains into a man who worked long nights as an insurance agent. His wife Denise was polite in the early days, always bringing me tea and calling me Mom. But something shifted when they decided the house should no longer be cluttered with old things. They didn't mean the curtains or the furniture. They meant me. At first, the changes were subtle. The spare key I kept in the kitchen drawer was missing. Marcus said he had put it somewhere safe. The mailbox was suddenly locked, and when I asked for the key, Denise told me she had already taken care of the bills. "Don't worry about all that paperwork anymore. Just relax." The way she smiled didn't match her words. The smell of control came slowly, like damp creeping through the walls. They changed the Wi-Fi password without telling me, and when I asked for it, Denise replied, "Oh, Mama, you don't really need it. It's too confusing for you anyway." Confusing, that word landed like a stone on my chest, as if being 65 made me invisible, incapable, less than. One night, Marcus brought home a new lockbox. He set it up in the study, where I used to keep all my documents: birth certificates, property papers, letters from my late husband Elijah. I asked him why, and he muttered something about security. But when I tried to open the drawer where my folders had always been, the keys were gone. I began to sense that something larger was moving beneath the surface. A plan, a scheme written in whispers behind closed doors. And though my heart trembled, I knew I had to watch closely. I had to gather every detail. Because if I didn't, I would lose not just my home, but the very proof of my life. That was the night I started writing everything down. Dates, times, small details. I hid the notebook inside an old sewing kit no one ever touched. My hands shook as I wrote, but my mind grew sharper with every word. They thought I was confused, but I was awake. It was Marcus's 42nd birthday when the walls around me grew tighter. Denise set the dining table with new china, crisp napkins, and polished forks that reflected the light too brightly. She said it was a special dinner, but the air smelled more like ceremony than celebration. The roast beef was carved carefully, glasses of wine poured with exaggerated cheer, yet there was no warmth in the room. I sat at the far end of the table, close enough to see my granddaughter Naomi's quiet eyes watching me, but far enough to feel like a guest in a house I had paid for brick by brick. Denise spoke quickly, filling the silence with words that felt rehearsed. "Mama, you've worked so hard all your life. Maybe it's time to let go of the little things around the house, don't you think? Rest more, enjoy yourself." She placed more meat on my plate, even though my appetite had vanished. Marcus nodded absent-mindedly, his mind elsewhere, his phone lighting up every few minutes on the table. Naomi barely touched her peas, pushing them around in circles with her fork. I could feel her eyes drifting toward me, searching for reassurance, but I had none to give that night. They never mentioned Elijah. They never spoke of the man who had built this home with his bare hands, who worked as a mechanic during the day and sang gospel hymns at night while fixing old radios in the garage. They didn't mention the sacrifices I made, cleaning offices at dawn, ironing uniforms late into the evening, saving every penny to keep the roof above us. In their new language of assets and efficiency, my years of labor were footnotes erased by convenience. It was in those moments that I started to see the threads unraveling. The bank letters that arrived addressed to me but written in Denise's handwriting. The small withdrawals I hadn't authorized. The insurance papers Marcus brought home late at night, asking me to sign quickly without explaining. One evening, I discovered that my medical insurance card had been replaced with a new one, except the mailing address was no longer mine. When I asked, Denise smiled faintly and said, "We're just streamlining everything for you, Mama. You don't need to worry." The word worry had become their weapon. Whenever I raised a question, I was told not to worry. Whenever I hesitated, I was told I was imagining things. They dismissed my memories as confusion, my concerns as weakness. But what they didn't realize was that I had lived through storms much greater than this. I had survived losing Elijah, raising Marcus alone, enduring nights when there was no dinner on the table but hope. Their lies were sharp, yes, but they were not stronger than my will. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen. Naomi's half-finished glass of milk was still on the table, a tiny fingerprint smudged on the rim. I stared at it for a long time, hearing Elijah's voice in my memory. Hold on to the truth, no matter how small, because it's the only weapon no one can steal from you. So I began to gather evidence. I photographed the altered documents. I saved screenshots of my email. I copied bank records into a small folder I hid inside the lining of my winter coat. Every piece of paper, every timestamp, every little detail was mine to protect. They thought I was fading into the background, but I was becoming sharper, harder, like steel and fire. When Arthur, Elijah's old choir partner, called me a week later, I almost broke down. He said he had tried to stop by, but Denise told him I wasn't well enough to see visitors. That I was receiving treatment. My chest tightened. Treatment. A word meant to cage me. Arthur wasn't fooled. His voice on the phone was calm, but edged with suspicion. "Are you all right, Amelia?" he asked. I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. Then I answered with the only truth I could offer at that moment. "I'm seeing things more clearly now," and from that moment, I knew this wasn't just survival anymore. It was the beginning of a fight they never expected me to wage. At first it seemed like a series of small, almost domestic inconveniences: an odd postcard slipped under the door, a utility bill forwarded without my knowledge, a checkbook missing from the drawer where I had kept it for years. But the way those little things lined up felt less like chance, and more like footsteps behind me, closing in. I found a letter one morning in the stack of mail, my name on the envelope, but the content addressed to Denise. It spoke of a change in title, of new ownership, stamped with a date I did not remember signing. My hands went cold. I read it again and again, until the letters blurred into a pattern of betrayal. When I confronted Denise, she smiled in that practiced way of someone trying to be comforting and in control at once. "Mama, you must be remembering wrong. We handled the paperwork months ago. You were tired. You trusted me to do it. You told me to finish what needed finishing." Her words were a soft curtain that hid the iron bars behind. Marcus leaned against the doorway as if waiting for a cue. He didn't argue, he only watched, his eyes flat. "Maybe it slipped your mind," he offered, as if memory were a misplaced item rather than a right. The word confused came back again, but I refused to let it stick. Confusion was a label they used to make me small. I began to collect. I made copies of every page I could get my hands on. I learned how to export bank statements and how to freeze accounts long enough to get a paper trail. I filled a shoebox with printed emails, scanned receipts, and photocopies of signatures. I took pictures of the calendar where I had marked the dates of important calls, the visits from the notary, the evenings I had signed forms. Each photograph was a small rebellion, a way of shouting without sound. I put a thumb drive into a secret pocket of an old coat I had sewn years ago and hid that coat at the back of the wardrobe where the moths never went. There were odd transactions I didn't recognize, small amounts, siphoned off in ways that seemed almost ceremonial. 500 here, 300 there, rounded numbers meant to hide the true theft. A transfer appeared to a company I had never heard of, registered to a name that sounded like one of Marcus's old high school friends. When I went to the bank with my shoebox, the teller's face shifted from routine disinterest to a kind of professional concern. She printed out pages, circled dates, and whispered, "This needs a lawyer." The word lawyer felt like an arrival bell in a long, dark room. Arthur's calls increased. He would arrive with a thermos of coffee and a quiet gaze that seemed to look past the surface and into the pattern of things. He brought up social media posts. I had missed photos of a remodeled living room, a caption about finally having our own place, comments from friends congratulating them. There were pictures of the new curtains, the new lamp, Naomi holding a cushion like a trophy. Arthur's finger hovered over the screen when he showed them to me. "They're telling a story," he said simply. "We just have to read it properly." I set up a system of my own: daily voice notes, time-stamped photographs, copies of every message. I learned to be methodical in secrecy. Whenever Denise texted me, I saved the screenshots. When she called, I recorded the call and stored the file under a different name. It felt strange at first, like stealing something back from myself, but I knew the law would need proof that this was not a lapse of memory, not the mercy of time, but a deliberate erasure. And so I kept going. I watched them arrange their lives around a story that excluded me, while I assembled a different story on the margins, one built of evidence and patience. In the quiet hours, with the house seeming to hold its breath, I would open the shoebox and lay the papers out across the dining table, not to read them again, but to feel the weight of what I had managed to keep. Each page was a small victory, a stitch in a garment of truth I was starting to wear like armor. The cameras appeared almost like shadows, one morning in the corner of the living room, another fixed discreetly in the hallway, where the pictures of my youth once hung. Denise claimed they were for security, a protection for all of us, but no one had asked if I wanted to live under that silent watch. I would catch their red lights blinking at odd hours, as though they were winking, mocking me for having allowed this invasion. I stopped moving freely in my own house, choosing instead to walk silently, pausing at corners, listening before I entered a room. Marcus tightened the rules. Further, this bathroom was now for guests. That chair was replaced with something more modern. Slowly, my world shrank into the walls of the small bedroom I had claimed as my own. Naomi was the only one who didn't change. She would linger at the kitchen table when everyone else left, her small fingers tracing the grain of the wood as though she was writing something invisible. One afternoon, while the others were away, she slipped into my room and handed me a folded note. Her eyes brimmed with hesitation, yet there was a clarity children often carry when adults pretend too much. The note was simple, written in shaky handwriting. "What they are doing to you is wrong. I believe you." I pressed that piece of paper into my porcelain mug, the last belonging of Elijah's that hadn't been stripped from me, and I swore silently that I would carry that note like scripture. By then, I had already met with Mr. Lane, the lawyer who once helped Elijah settle the garage lease. I remember sitting in his office surrounded by heavy books that smelled of dust and ink. My voice was calm, almost too calm, as I laid out the documents, the forged signatures, the altered bank slips. He studied each page, his brow furrowing deeper with every turn. "This transfer isn't valid," he said finally, tapping the paper. "There's evidence of coercion, forged handwriting, even possible identity theft. You were manipulated. Amelia, this isn't confusion, this is fraud." His words were like water poured over smoldering ashes, awakening something I thought had been extinguished. I walked out of that office not lighter, but denser, carrying with me a folder filled with photocopies and a heart brimming with a new kind of silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of preparation. I stopped raising my voice at home, stopped asking questions, stopped protesting when Denise redecorated or when Marcus avoided my eyes. They thought I was giving up, but in truth, I was retreating into invisibility. I moved like a shadow, observing, storing away every slight, every alteration, every slip of the tongue. They believed they had silenced me, but I was listening louder than ever. Denise began to act like the lady of the house, hosting friends, showing off the remodeled rooms. Marcus spoke less and less to me, and when he did, it was as if I were a tenant overstaying her welcome. But I didn't resist. I let them believe their victory was certain, because I knew what they did, not that I had evidence. I had time, and most importantly, I had resilience. I hid my anger beneath calm smiles, nodding when they spoke, withdrawing into myself when they mocked my forgetfulness. All the while, I was building a case, one that could not be erased by their laughter or dismissed by their lies. At night, in the quiet of my room, I would open my notebook and write long paragraphs about the day. The tone of Marcus's voice when he told me to think about other arrangements, the way Denise signed for a package in my name, the precise time when Naomi whispered, "Don't leave me, Grandma." Every detail was evidence, every line a brick in the wall I was constructing. I refused to let the truth vanish into their rewritten story. And though I seemed invisible to them, I was more present than I had ever been in my life, gathering strength in the silence they mistook for surrender. The day of my expulsion arrived, not with shouting but with the cold efficiency of strangers. Denise came home with 2 uniformed officers, her voice steady as she explained that I was trespassing in her property. I stood in the hallway clutching the handle of a canvas bag I had packed days earlier, as if some part of me had known this moment would come. The officers were polite but detached, guiding me toward the door with hands that held neither cruelty nor compassion. Marcus stood behind them with his arms folded, his expression a mask of quiet satisfaction. Naomi peeked from the top of the staircase, her face pale, her lips trembling as though she wanted to scream but couldn't. Denise recited lines as if rehearsed. "We've warned her before. She refuses to leave. This is our home now." Not once did she look me in the eye. The betrayal in her voice cut deeper than the officer's firm grip on my elbow. I wanted to shout that the walls remembered me, that every nail hammered, every tile polished carried my fingerprints. But my throat locked. No one spoke for me. No neighbor stepped forward, and the silence of the hallway felt heavier than iron chains. I gathered what little I could fit into the bag, a blouse with frayed sleeves, a pair of wool socks, a photograph from my wedding day where Elijah's smile glowed brighter than the sun, and the porcelain mug that had survived every purge. That mug felt heavier than gold as I placed it carefully between folded clothes. I stepped outside, the slam of the door behind me echoing like a verdict. Strangely, what I felt was not defeat, but relief. Relief that the mask was finally dropped, that they no longer pretended. They believed they had stripped me of everything, but in their arrogance, they overlooked what I carried: the folder of documents, the USB drive, the silent arsenal of truth. They thought they had caged me, but in reality, they had set me free. The cab driver asked where I wanted to go, and I hesitated, realizing I had no destination. I muttered the name of a small motel near the hospital where Naomi had been born, a place I remembered from years ago. The ride there was quiet, the city outside blurring into streaks of gray and neon. My phone battery was nearly dead, my future uncertain, but my resolve burned steady. The motel was unimpressive peeling wallpaper, the faint smell of mildew, an elevator that groaned with every floor. The receptionist glanced at me with curiosity but handed me a key without question. My room was small, the carpet stained, the window rattling when the wind blew. I set my bag down, pulled out the mug, and placed it on the nightstand like a relic. I sat on the edge of the bed, not crying, not trembling, only thinking. I had lost a house, but not my truth. That night, I sent a short message to Arthur. "They pushed me out. Call me." He rang within 10 minutes, his voice steady yet charged with anger he tried to suppress. "Amelia, are you safe? Tell me where you are." His words felt like a lifeline thrown into stormy water. We arranged to meet the next morning at a small diner, the kind with checkered tablecloths and steaming coffee pots. When we met, Arthur listened without interrupting, his eyes locked on mine. He pulled out his phone and showed me what he had gathered. Screenshots of Denise's social media posts bragging about our new life, photographs of the house with captions claiming ownership, and comments from friends congratulating them on finally securing their future. Each image was a nail in the coffin of their lies. Arthur's voice was calm but sharp. "We will fight this, Amelia." Not with rage, but with precision. I nodded, and for the first time since stepping out of that house, I felt something stronger than sorrow. I felt justice stirring awake. Life in the motel settled into a rhythm of quiet determination. Each morning, I would wake before sunrise, brew the weak coffee provided in the lobby, and spread out my documents on the small desk beneath the flickering light. The sound of traffic outside became background music to my mission. Arthur visited often, sometimes with pastries wrapped in paper bags, sometimes with nothing but his steady presence. Together, we pieced through bank statements, notarized forms, and signatures that betrayed their own forgery. Every document we uncovered was another stone laid in the foundation of my case, and with each day, my silence hardened into resolve. I went back to the bank, folder in hand, and sat across from a young woman whose eyes shifted from polite courtesy to alarm as she scanned the files. She whispered, "This isn't right. These signatures don't align. The dates contradict the transactions. Whoever processed this either didn't look or didn't care." She printed fresh copies, stamped them, and slid them toward me with a sympathetic glance. I tucked them carefully into my folder, feeling the weight of truth grow heavier in my hands. Denise sent me 3 messages during those weeks. The first was a brief apology, dripping with false sorrow. "I'm sorry it's come to this, but you left us no choice." The second was sharper, shifting blame onto me. "You refuse to accept change, and you're making things harder for everyone." The third was the most revealing, a thinly veiled threat. "If you insist on causing trouble, we'll be forced to take legal action." I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I printed the texts, dated them, and slid them into my growing archive. Words meant to intimidate became evidence of guilt. The lawyer, Mr. Lane, reviewed my materials with increasing astonishment. He shook his head as he pointed to discrepancies, muttering, "Forgery, financial abuse, property fraud. This is bigger than a civil dispute, Amelia. This is criminal." He explained that we could not only reclaim the house but also demand damages for the emotional and financial manipulation I had endured. I nodded slowly, my jaw clenched. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was justice, not only for myself but for Naomi, so she would grow up knowing that lies do not outlive truth. Naomi managed to call me one afternoon from her school's office phone. Her voice was small, frightened, but steady. "Grandma, I miss you. Mom says you're sick with resentment, that you don't want to talk to us. But I know that's not true." My throat tightened, but I held my voice steady. "I'm okay, my love. I'm building something for us, a place where you will always be welcome. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She whispered, "Can I see you soon?" I told her yes, though I didn't know how or when. That call became another ember of hope I carried inside me. I also began recording audio diaries, not just for evidence, but for myself. Into the small recorder Arthur had brought me, I poured out memories, thoughts, and words Elijah once told me. "The one who waits with dignity wins with time." Hearing my own voice replayed reminded me that I was not invisible, that I still existed beyond their attempts to erase me. I described the documents, the conversations, the nights of betrayal, sealing them into sound the way one seals a letter to be opened by the future. Arthur helped me find a handwriting expert, a man with sharp eyes, who examined the documents with the precision of a surgeon. He compared my authentic signature against the fraudulent ones and confirmed what I already knew. The transfers were forged. His certified report became the keystone of my case, a weapon sharper than any argument. When we finally filed the lawsuit, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a quiet steadiness, like standing on solid ground after years of drifting. The case wasn't just about bricks and walls. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about drawing a boundary that even betrayal could not cross. And as I sealed the envelope with the first stack of evidence, I whispered to myself, "They think I am broken, but they have only awakened the part of me that never surrenders." The courthouse smelled like paper and patience, that dry scent of lives stacked into folders. I sat beside Mr. Lane with my back straight and my palms open on my skirt, feeling every year I had lived settle into my spine like a pledge. Across the aisle, Denise kept her gaze fixed on a point above my shoulder, as if I were an empty chair. Marcus adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd had since high school debates, except this time his eyes were hard and restless. The judge entered with the quiet authority of someone who has seen every flavor of lie and is bored of the taste. We began. Mr. Lane's voice was steady, the pages turning like metronomes. He laid out the chain of events without flourish. The bank anomalies, the mail reroutes, the signature overlays, the timeline that did not bend even when pressed. When the handwriting expert took the stand, he spoke like a craftsman, explaining strokes and pressures, the rhythm of authenticity versus the mechanical wobble of imitation. He did not attack, he measured. When he concluded, the room held a new kind of silence, the kind that follows a door clicking into the only lock that fits. Denise's attorney tried to float a story about misunderstandings, an older woman grieving, generous with powers of attorney, casual with paperwork, a family merely regularizing what she had wanted all along. He said words like streamlining and caretaking and transitional planning, as if betrayal could be filed under administration. Mr. Lane did not raise his voice. He simply returned to dates that could not coexist. Notarizations signed by a clerk who had retired 2 summers earlier, IP addresses from devices never registered in my name, and text messages where concern was dressed as command. The judge frowned, not theatrically, but with the slow displeasure of a person discovering mildew behind fresh paint. He asked 2 questions, only 2, and both were about consent. Not the word on a line, but the moment in time where agreement is born. Denise looked down. Marcus swallowed. Their lawyer requested a brief recess. The judge granted 10 minutes, no more. In the hallway, the air tasted metallic. Arthur stood a few feet away, hands folded over a small manila envelope. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I thought of Naomi, pencil-smudged fingers, and brave little notes. And I let that thought anchor me while cameras blinked at the end of the corridor like patient insects. When we returned, Mr. Lane introduced the bank officer who had flagged the inconsistencies and the clerk from the records office who testified politely, succinctly, that a certain file number simply did not exist in any ledger they maintained. These were not accusations. They were coordinates. And when placed on the same map, they formed only one path. By late afternoon, the judge issued a temporary order, freezing all transactions connected to my house and accounts associated with it. No sales, no leases, no alterations, no evasions. The gavel did not thunder. It landed like clear rain on dusty ground. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Outside, a reporter asked if I had a statement. I shook my head and said nothing, because the truest things sometimes require no decoration. Back in my room at the motel, I boiled water in the small kettle, poured it into my porcelain mug, and listened to the steam write a soft hymn against the window. I spoke into my recorder with a voice I recognized again. Today they met the shape of the truth and it did not fit in their pockets. I slept with the folder beneath my pillow, not as a talisman but as a reminder that I had rebuilt myself into evidence. Line by line, breath by breath, until the story I carried could stand on its own feet and look any stranger in the eye. The second hearing carried a different weight, thicker, like a storm waiting to burst. The courtroom was fuller this time, reporters with notepads, neighbors curious to see if whispers they had heard were true, and faces I recognized but could not name. Denise walked in wearing neutral colors, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her expression carved into something that was neither guilt nor defiance, but emptiness. Marcus, restless as ever, tapped his foot against the tile, the rhythm sharp and impatient. Their lawyer tried a new angle, painting me as fragile, a grieving widow unable to adapt to modern realities. He spoke of generational gaps, of how my supposed forgetfulness was nothing more than age catching up. He even brought up Elijah, as though the death of my husband excused the theft of my life. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. I sat still, hands folded, breathing slow, because dignity was my strongest weapon. Mr. Lane rose calmly, introducing new evidence. He played a video, shaky in angle, but sharp and content. Denise was seated at a desk I had never seen, papers in front of her, a pen in hand. Her voice, unmistakable, filled the room. "Mark, are you sure there's no turning back from this?" And Marcus's reply, equally clear, "Trust me, it's legal. No one's going to say anything." The words cracked through the courtroom like thunder. For a moment, even the judge seemed to forget the ritual of neutrality. He paused the video, ordered silence, and studied their faces. Denise's eyes shut tightly, as though wishing the floor would open beneath her. Marcus swallowed hard, his confidence evaporating in plain sight. Their lawyer scrambled, asking to suspend the session. The judge shook his head. The hearing would continue. Each minute afterward was agony for them. But for me, it was air-filling lungs that had long been pressed flat. When we stepped outside, the crowd had grown. Questions rained down, journalists demanding to know how a mother could be dispossessed by her own blood. I said nothing. The headlines spoke for me the next morning. Daughter and son-in-law accused of property fraud. Family betrayal unfolds in court. The shame was no longer mine to carry. Naomi sent me a text that evening. "Grandma, I saw something weird on Mom's phone. Are you okay? Can I see you?" My heart ached, but I answered quickly, giving her a time and a place. Sunday, 4 o'clock, at the square near the old movie theater. She came wrapped in a red scarf, notebook clutched to her chest. She hugged me so tightly, I thought she might never let go. She whispered, "Mom says you turned against us. But I remember when you held me when your hands hurt, when no one else cared. You never turned against me." She opened the notebook to show me her drawings. A house, a woman with silver hair by a window, a mug of tea, and a tree with a flower at its roots. Our memories, preserved in pencil lines by the child they could not corrupt. I kissed her forehead and told her softly, "This will always be your safe place. No one will ever take that from you." Back at the widow Carroll's house, where I rented a small room, she handed me an old radio she no longer used. That night, I turned it on and let violins fill the silence. I fell asleep with music in my ears, dreaming not of battles lost but of victories waiting patiently in the dark. The next morning, Mr. Lane called with news that made my pulse quicken. He had found a fatal flaw in the deed Marcus and Denise had submitted. The notary's name belonged to a man who had died years before the supposed signing. A ghost had signed my life away. It was evidence no court could ignore. When Carol placed the envelope in my hands one quiet afternoon, I knew it carried more than paper. Inside was the official notice. The judge had frozen the property entirely. No sales, no rentals, no remodeling. For the first time in months, the house was legally mine again, even if my feet no longer touched its floors. I sat at Carol's kitchen table, tracing the seal with trembling fingers while the kettle whistled. Relief and grief tangled together inside, mere relief that justice had begun to speak, grief that it had taken so much betrayal to reach this moment. Carol poured me tea without asking, her silence a language I understood perfectly. Not long after, Denise called me directly for the first time in weeks. Her voice was cracked, stripped of the gloss she once wore. She asked to meet at a small coffee shop near the bus terminal. I hesitated but agreed, knowing the conversation itself might reveal more than any signature. She arrived without makeup, her eyes sunken, her shoulders bent under a weight she could no longer disguise. She didn't order anything, only sat across from me and whispered, "I don't know when we stopped being us." I didn't answer. She spoke on, blaming Marcus, admitting he had told her it would be easier, that I wouldn't care, that I hardly used the house anymore. She confessed that she wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than accepting that they were stealing from me. Her words spilled like water from a cracked vase, unable to be gathered again. I reached into my bag and unfolded a copy of the original deed, my name beside Elijah's, the date sharp and unalterable. I placed it gently on the table. "This is what you ignored. This is what you tried to erase." She looked at it but didn't touch it. Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no satisfaction. Her sorrow did not return what was taken. She whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." And I replied with the only truth there was, "You can't, but you can stop lying." She left quickly, without goodbye, and I remained, staring out at the street, where buses came and went. each one carrying people who would never know the battle unfolding at that little table. Days later, their lawyer sent a settlement proposal. They would relinquish the property if I dropped the lawsuit and signed a non-disclosure agreement. I tore it into pieces without reading further. I didn't want their silence. I wanted my truth, spoken aloud in a room where lies could no longer hide. Arthur reminded me that this fight was bigger than walls and furniture. It was about boundaries, about dignity that could not be purchased or bartered. The third hearing arrived heavy with anticipation. The expert testified about the forged documents. The bank officer laid out the transfers to a shell company linked to Marcus's acquaintances, and every word stacked against them like stones in a wall closing in. Marcus lost his temper, shouting that I was senile, that Arthur manipulated me, that the whole system was against him. The judge silenced him with a stern warning, threatening removal from the courtroom. Denise lowered her head, speaking nothing, her silence louder than any defense. Their lawyer asked for recess after recess, but the judge refused. Outside, the press was waiting again. Headlines the next day carried words like fraud, elder abuse, family betrayal. The shame, once buried under their cleverness, now belonged solely to them. That night, Carol brought me soup and laid a knitted blanket over my shoulders. I slept soundly for the first time in months, dreaming of Elijah's voice saying, "You're almost there. Keep walking." I woke with clarity. This fight wasn't just for a roof, or for walls, or for possessions. It was for Naomi, for the little girl who still drew pictures of me by the window, for the woman I had always been, for the truth that could not be buried under signatures forged in darkness. The final trial loomed ahead, and I was ready to face it, not with rage, but with a calm that had been earned through fire. The morning of the final trial dawned gray, a sky thick with clouds that pressed low against the courthouse roof. I dressed in the same navy blouse I had worn to Elijah's funeral, not out of sentiment but out of strength, because that day I carried the weight of truth alone, just as I had carried the weight of loss years before. Carol brewed me a strong cup of coffee and placed it silently at the edge of the table. Arthur arrived at 8 sharp, his steps steady, his eyes calm, carrying a manila envelope filled with every fragment of proof we had assembled. We walked together into the crowded courtroom where reporters, neighbors, and curious strangers sat waiting for the conclusion of a story they had been following like a serialized tragedy. Denise entered late, hair loose, face pale, lips pressed thin. She looked diminished, her confidence dissolved. Marcus didn't appear at all. Rumors spread that he had left the country days earlier under a false name. Their lawyer tried to sever Denise from the storm, painting her as a victim of manipulation, a wife who trusted too much. He spoke with urgency, trying to reshape her role from conspirator to casualty. But the judge had listened too long to excuses in his career to be deceived by another. He scrutinized every inconsistency, weighed every testimony, and finally turned his gaze toward me. Mr. Lane presented the last pieces of evidence, the forged notary stamp belonging to a man already deceased, the financial transfers linking Marcus to a fraudulent account, the recorded video where both their voices confessed more than any document ever could. Arthur even took the stand, testifying about the social media posts, about the false claims of ownership paraded publicly while I was pushed into shadows. The weight of truth filled the room like a rising tide, leaving no ground for lies to stand. When the judge delivered his verdict, the words were not dramatic, not thunderous, but measured, precise, irrevocable. The property was mine, restored fully under the law. Compensation would follow, damages for the deception, penalties for the forged signatures, and financial abuse. More than restitution, it was recognition, proof that my voice, once dismissed as confused, now carried the authority of justice. Denise broke into tears, her shoulders shaking. The gavel fell, and with it, a chapter of betrayal closed. I walked out of the courthouse into a crowd of cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted questions, neighbors whispered, but I said nothing. Silence was my answer, the same silence they had mistaken for weakness but which had been my greatest strength. Arthur placed his arm lightly at my back, and guided me past the flashing bulbs. Carol welcomed me home later that evening with warm bread and tea, her eyes shining with quiet pride. Naomi visited soon after, clutching her notebook full of drawings and a dried flower she had pressed between its pages. She left it on my table, whispering, "Now you'll always have something alive here with you." That night, I sat by the window, pouring tea into Elijah's porcelain mug. The rain tapped gently on the glass while the radio hummed a soft piano piece. I whispered into my recorder. They thought they had erased me, but truth cannot be erased. They thought they had won, but victory belongs to those who endure with dignity. For the first time in years, I looked at my reflection in the window pane and did not turn away. And now, to you who have listened to my story, if it touched you, if it reminded you of your own struggles, I ask you kindly, subscribe to this channel, join this community where stories like mine find voice and healing. Share in the comments what you felt, what you learned, and if you too have lived through storms that tried to take away your dignity. This space is not just mine, it is ours, a place where pain can be transformed into resilience, and silence into strength. Your story matters, and together, we can keep truth alive.